for hard conversations, we're going to talk about ability. And so I guess getting right into it, since 45 minutes is not a lot of time, so I want to make sure that we're good on time. I guess starting off with, for you, how would you identify in terms of ability when it comes to you, and in terms of like thinking in terms of how you navigate in the world, based on the expectations that exist?
Like, how do I identify? That's what you asked, right?
Let's start with kind of like how we identify. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Also, I just want to point out to folks who are watching on Facebook Live, if you have any questions, for us, we may or may not be able to answer based on our own personal experiences, but we certainly will try. But if you have any questions or comments or anything that you'd like to offer or maybe want to know, please go ahead and post in the comments, and we will periodically check. I have the Facebook Live going on the side here, so we will check to make sure that, we are having this conversation with you all just as much as we are having it with ourselves, right? So how do I identify ability-wise? Physically, definitely able-bodied, right? I have a lot of bodily-wise, like, I'm a very strong person. I have never had any issues with my body. I've had health issues in the past when I was younger, but certainly nothing that inhibited my ability in any way, shape, or form. That's about it. I'm 36, I don't wear glasses, things like that. Even like smaller things that people might not consider ability related, which actually are. I don't have, ability wise, I'm very, very able bodied, I think, right? As far as my physical body is concerned. As far as my neurological ability, sounds about right? As far as my neurological ability, I definitely think that I have some learning disabilities. I think I still have them. I think they most affected me when I was a child. But again, I don't know why, but I developed coping mechanisms around it. Do you know what I'm saying? I don't want it to ever seem like simply, I get tokenized a lot for the things that I've been through and having come out of it, when really nobody should have to go through those things to begin with, right? So I don't want my having, conquered, to have whatever word you want to put by that, coped with it, I guess, right? To have any sort of measure for anybody else. So I'm just being very conscious. Ability is the identity that I have to think about, that I think about the least in my life, right? And so coming from that place of privilege, I want to be incredibly conscious now with how little I'm aware of my own abilities, simply because I don't always have to be, right? So I feel like definitely when I think there's definitely some neurodivergency at play in terms of how I learn. And I just think, like, definitely the systems that I grew up in were not set up for somebody who learns the way that I do, because I consider myself a highly intelligent human being. And yet, if you looked at any of my test scores, like literally any of my test scores post 5th grade onward, that middle school developmental stage, I did not test well at all. Those would not speak to who I am, including when I was in college, through all of my master's degrees, so on and so forth. I'm someone who enjoys, I'm a writer, I'm a poet, right? But reading is very difficult for me. So I have developed a mechanism of, I read a lot, and I read a lot of very heavy work, right? But if I was to actually focus on the writing itself, I would probably not get through 2 pages for about 4 hours. I'm not exaggerating. And that's not because I'm so in tune with the book. It's simply because, and I don't know where this falls on anything, right? I'm just sharing. It's simply because when I engage in in-depth reading, it's very hard for me to get past a couple of sentences. I keep going back and repeating it, you know? So I don't know what form of anything that is. That's just how it is, right? And I developed that. I used to read voraciously until I was in the 9th or the 10th grade. And then I started developing this pattern of reading. And then it just became so tedious that I stopped reading completely. And then when I went to college, undergrad, right, I was in English literature. It's a lot of reading, right? I developed this method where I would just, because I have the capacity to grasp concepts and things so quickly, I would read really fast, right? And so I wouldn't let myself dwell on, I wouldn't let myself stop anywhere. I would just read really quickly, and then I would just grasp whatever it was that I was grasping, and it was enough for me to do fairly decently. Anything that was annotated that required more, you know, who said this to whom, when and why was a common question in our examinations. So you had to know, especially like with plays like Shakespeare and Faust and stuff like that, you had to know specific passages, specific dialogues and stuff. And so it was just those pieces. What I would do was, I hated this, but what I had to do was, you have something called a guide, right? Which essentially prepares you for the exam. So it tells you what the most likely quotes are that examiners will pick out for your examination, right? So it's like Cliff Notes with a little bit of added cheating to it, right? Like allowed cheating to it. So I would engage in the allowed cheating, right? And then I had like a good group of friends who I would study with who would also like bring up stuff. And so I would write it down to the point where when I was doing that and I just had to focus on those pieces of it, like I could still speed read through those. And then in the context of the entire play, sometimes if I didn't know a particular dialogue, because I knew the context, I would just use systems of deduction to figure out who most likely said that to whom, you know? So things like that. So I just came up with those kinds of coping mechanisms because, I mean, I sure did not want to admit it. You know, I used to do a lot of like speeches and stuff like that in school, and I was known for my reading and I was known for my writing and stuff. And so definitely did not want to admit that I was going through this. So I just figured out other ways to do it. Yeah. All the way to my master's, nothing changed.
I think like this is, it's just kind of like, it's because of how, when we think about just the fact that like that sense of like expectation of this is how you need to function and these are the ways that we test knowledge and things like that, like
Right.
all of that comes into play there.
Sure.
Do you, kind of going a little bit deeper into that piece, but then also you mentioned like privilege as well, and kind of like thinking both from like, yes, neurological standpoint, but there's emotional and neurological, cognitive, physical. What do you think are expectations that, I think you went into this a little bit with what you were just talking about, but like what are expectations that have been placed on you in terms of ability, whether or not you were able to meet those expectations or not? Like what are some of those expectations that have been placed or are expected, and what are maybe some expectations that that you and like we as as a society have like internalized and like taken for granted in how we go about navigating the world?
Oh, that second question is a big one. I will contribute what I can.
Yeah. Sorry.
And then like, no, fine. I will contribute what I can, and then you should definitely jump in on this because I know like social emotional learning, things like that are your areas of expertise, and so you've seen a lot with our young humans as far as those pieces are concerned. Not that I'm not aware of it, it's just that I can't speak to it the way that you can. I shouldn't be speaking to it the way that you can. What was the first question? What are some expectations?
Expectations that have been placed on you, like that you've felt like you've had to internalize, or like even if you've been able to meet those expectations, like what are some of the expectations that um, potentially have to do with ability on along these sort of different ways of thinking about ability?
I just have like a huge problem with institutionalized education, Ben. You know, like on every platform, I just have a huge problem with that because even like when I was doing my master's degree, right, I got so much criticism because of how much I wouldn't read, you know, because you have readings for every class, right? And there were just some days where I couldn't read anymore. Like I didn't, not because I was tired, I just didn't have the capacity to read the way that I read that much because I was tired. Yeah, I was tired because of the methodology of reading that I was, that I had, that I have, right? It takes a lot out of you. You know what I'm saying? Because like even if I stop for 1 second over one paragraph, like it really just messes me up for the next like hour or so. It just takes a lot of time, you know. So things like that. But also like when you love what you do, know what you're reading, sometimes you misstep. You don't you step outside of your strategy, right? So just it gets really it's just so much to think about when you have to just read a paper, for crying out loud, you know, not even a book, like a paper, 5 page article shouldn't take some, that's my own criticism of myself, sorry, takes me so long. It's just very annoying given that the time frame within which everybody is functioning is the same, right? So there's no like difference, you know, there's no, oh, for you we'll do it like this, for you we'll do it like this, like this is most beneficial for you, blah blah blah. And I'm a visual learner, you know, and so when it comes to like a master's education where you're just constantly reading paper after paper after paper, book after book after book, it's not, it doesn't cater to your primary style of learning. Yeah, so it just gets very like, it gets very cumbersome up there, you know. And it just it feels like a lot to the point where you're like, forget this, I don't know, I don't want to do this, it's just so much, right? It's so much harder than what everybody else expects it should be, right? So I think some of the expectations being that simply because you're an intelligent human, or not simply because, if you're in your master's degree, you should be able to do these things. Well, yes, and is that really the most valuable measure of somebody's intelligence? How does that work, right? So that was things like that. I think those intelligence is very important to me, right? That's like my most, for me, that's my biggest asset is my intelligence. And so constantly having your intelligence questioned because of some sort of theoretical methodology that is supposed to work for everyone, but there's literally no research that shows. There's literally research that shows one standard methodology does not work for everyone. There is no research that shows one standard methodology works for everyone, and yet the pedagogy that we use is standardized, which is why one of the biggest words that you always see in academia is standardized, right? And so for me, like that's that whole way of teaching, this one way for everybody way of teaching is just really difficult. Um, those expectations, right? So there are those expectations. Uh, ask me more when, like, can you ask me more specific questions when you're asking about other abilities?
Um, so I think like even though, for example, you said like physically, you know, you come from a place of privilege of like, okay, like being strong and you know, I know you do Muay Thai and like you know you're constantly like hiking, like you're a fit person, um, and I think in the sort of the same way, right, of like those that language creeps up on us, like the I should, like the shoulds, and those kinds of expectations that are, and I think this is kind of getting into a little bit more of that bigger question of like our systems in our society and things like that. But like, how have you internalized, or how has that affected you in terms of even those things that you might you might fit that standard in some cases, and at the same time, have you felt the pressure or the have you felt that expectation even in things where it's like I can meet this expectation and yet I still feel it?
Like every identity, ability to does not stand alone, right? So I think where I feel that piece of it the most, and all of this is, it feels really superficial, but because it is, but I'm also a really vain person. So, it plays a huge part in my life, is that when you are a masculine performing lesbian who prides herself and performs her masculinity the way that I do, right? With so much, who places so much significance on her masculinity the way that I do, right? The fact that I'm short, the fact that I'm smaller built, comes into play a lot in general, right? Yeah, you get the word, oh my God, you're so tiny. Please don't say that to anybody, like unless they've specifically given you permission to do so. It's really not flattering, especially when people don't look at tiny and say, wow, you're so tiny. I mean strength. That's not what people are saying, right? The standard definition narrative around being small is that you are weak, you are incapable, you are physically lesser than other human beings, And I'm a strong person. Like, I'm a legit strong person, right? I engage in a lot of physical activities that I know many people who are much taller than me, cisgender men cannot engage in. And yet, because of how my masculinity is defined around my gender, that comes into play, right? It comes to a crossroads for some reason. And so then you feel like, well, you won't be able to do that because, you're a woman, but you won't be able to do that because you're a woman. You won't be able to do that because you're so small. You won't be able to do that, right? Which I have to say this, none of my kids, none of the boys that I have ever worked with at any time in these last 4 years that I've worked with at any time have ever seen me like that. Every single anytime I'm on baggage duty, right? I'm on baggage duty with Alex Trepper, who's like 6 feet tall, plays varsity, right? Works out every single day, whatever. And Alex every single time will look at me and be like, such a beast. And it makes me feel so good. You know what I'm saying? Like things like that. But like those societal expectations, again, don't live just by themselves in the binary. They also transcend across the spectrum. So then the expected ability of you is different and the same because of your gender identity and your gender performance, right? So you're a woman, so you won't be able to lift something that heavy, but you're a masculine performing woman, you won't be able to lift something that heavy. There's a little more of an arrogance to it, right? Neither is good, right? One is incredibly dismissive and the other one is like, wow, you're a masculine performing woman, you still can't lift that? Like that.
This is making me think of when you were talking about the intersection, right? It was making me think of rooted resistance. And I'm kind of curious about kind of like, because I think like one of the things that was appealing to me and like was what was resonating with me with rooted resistance was sort of this sense of like creating space for all bodies,
right?
To be in,
absolutely,
to engage in whatever level of wellness, right? And in public spaces. And so how, and again, like because I don't know too much about it, but in terms of for rooted resistance, like I don't know that much more beyond some of the basic stuff. How does, like, how do you kind of create or engage in, I guess, this idea of like fitness, right? Kind of like thinking about fitness and like how like immediately thinking about physical ability is like at such a high expectation. Like literally, even for me, like I am able-bodied, like I do not have a physical disability, and yet going into a gym, I'm like, I feel just like I don't belong here. So
Right.
like that level of expectation, right? Thinking of that spectrum, right? If we lived in a society where the expectation is that all of us need to be 6'6" and be able to be like, you know, a top tier physical athlete,
Right.
then all of us within that standard of society would have a disability, right? But because our standard is in a different space, right? This is we create a different, we're at a different point in that spectrum. But how do you create space for I guess for that diverse range of ability in something like rooted resistance? Or how do we create, or how do we, like, what does the vision look like in terms of when we have this idea around like fitness or physical ability, like how do we create a space that is more of a spectrum as opposed to a particular standard that you have to meet, achieve, and then go beyond?
I mean, so I think like moving away from words like fitness and healthy bodies, you know, like things like that, very coded words, right? You might be coming from, so like for myself, when I say I like to be healthy, I'm very cautious who I say that to. I am very cautious, more often than not, I just say it to myself, right? I'm very cautious of what that means and very quick to decodify what it already presumes, right? Because there's like, that word is incredibly coded. Fitness is also incredibly coded, right? So for rooted resistance, mostly like we believe that all bodies can engage in wellness, whether it looks like movement or not. You know what I'm saying? And it is important for all bodies, every single body, to be in the outdoors, occupying outdoor spaces. The two components of rooted resistance, right? It is to engage all bodies, period. Yes. And then to occupy spaces, public spaces outside that are typically meant for everybody, but really are not. Right? So when I go out every other day to work out, like at a college campus or so on and so forth, which I do because they're really empty right now. So it's easy for me to just take Sherlock there and go out there and do that. And I have my mace with me. I have to constantly think about what I'm doing with my mace, right? Like it has to be really visible so nobody else assumes that it's something else and not just a mace. You know what I'm saying? And so that kind of being cautious of where you are is also important for Black, Indigenous, people of color bodies to be out there in those public spaces that are supposed to be for everybody, but everybody knows that we don't occupy those spaces similarly. Right? So that is also a part of rooted resistance. Okay, so it's that double-edged sword, if you will, right? I'm going to tell you quickly for the next 1 minute what rooted resistance is and how we work on that spectrum, and then I'm throwing it back to you so that you can tell us about your experience as well, right? With ability. Right, so apart from that occupying spaces piece, for rooted resistance, it's just really important that people feel, if they want to move, people feel like there is a space for them to be able to move in. However it is, whatever level they are at, however it is that their bodies feel comfortable moving, whatever it is that their goals might look like, right? That's it. There's no goal that we create for people to reach a certain body type. There is, everybody is a beach body, everybody body is a hiking body, whatever landscape you choose to place it in. If there is a body there, it is that body. It is a body that is occupying that space. That's literally all that it is, right? And so with rock, what rock does is rock creates very specific patterns, movement patterns that people can follow through as and how they see fit. But the most, no pun intended, but the most important piece of that being is that they can come occupy a space that they are welcome in, that is for their body, whatever that body is. right? So creating that space is also really important. So it's not so much about what we're doing as opposed to the space that we're creating, right? And then within that, there is capacity to do so much, because now you've just opened yourself up to the spectrum instead of staying on this binary of what a cisgender male body should look like and what a cisgender female body should look like, right? Even for cisgender men and cisgender women, you just opened up the spectrum of what your body can look like. And once we are thinking about everything in terms of all bodies, not just two very specific types of bodies, you're just opening up the world for what kind of wellness we can look at. Because now you literally have resources from each of these different bodies, varied bodies, in terms of what does movement look like to you? What does wellness look like to you? What are your goals? Things like that. And everybody essentially gets to affirm and inspire and aspire from each other.
Very different from the standardized.
Definitely.
Like again, kind of going back to the standardized education and pedagogy, like.
Right. Absolutely. There is no standard, basically.
There is
no standard. You completely deconstruct standard and you focus on the space, and you focus on the fact that these are real human beings standing, sitting, being in front of you. And then you work from there based on what it is that they want. And all bodies within their capacity, right, benefit from some sort of movement, because we have limbs, we have joints, there are mechanics to our body, right? And so they benefit from some sort of movement should they be able to engage in it, right? To say that you can only engage in this one movement or this other movement is by itself incredibly, like, what is that? I don't even know what the word is for it. I mean, yes, colonial, patriarchal, supremacist, all of the above, for sure, right? Normative, all of the above. It's just so unnecessary, right? You learn so much by opening yourself up to so much more. And so, like, in a physical space, I understand that. In a physical space, that's what I have learned through my journey of having a lot of physical privilege. I'm still working my way through understanding that on an emotional and neurological perspective. Masa, all yours. Tell us more about you. Your experiences navigating the world through ability, your understandings of the various abilities, like you said, emotional, cognitive, neurological, learning, physical.
So I think for me, definitely privilege and ability in terms of in general, right? And all which has happened. Are you okay, Sam?
Yes, I'm perfectly fine. Please carry on. My dog just hit the door. With her head. She wants to come inside. Okay. I can't have her doing that, but thank you. Please carry on.
Physically, I think definitely, again, going back to like kind of almost like doing the inventory of like, what are the things that I don't think about, that I take for granted. And like, that kind of is like a good indicator of like what, the privileges that I have. So like, I think like, I definitely think about, for example, how it intersects with exactly what you were saying of like the standards or the expectations or like the biases and norms. So like, definitely like it wasn't until going into a little bit more detail with like Anytown and like doing more identity-based learning and work and like reflection, that I like really paid attention to spaces, right? Those spaces when I would go into, and it's like, how does this space create like, instead of expecting a standard and projecting that onto the person, like how does the space create inclusion? So definitely like things like ramps, stairs, elevators, like thinking about even with like Anytown, like I think that was like one of the big things that I definitely did some growing and learning in, was like, how do I make sure that I'm thinking alternatively and creatively, and not just kind of going into, oh, here's an activity and it requires everyone to stand up and move around. Like, how do I make sure that I'm like being cognizant of the different activities that we do so that it is something that everyone is able to engage in, and not something that is creating that exclusion because I'm setting up the space that way.
Right.
So those are all things that I think point to the fact that, like, yeah, like I don't have to think about these things because of my privilege, and because I meet those standards and expectations. And then at the same time, I think like thinking about how do I make sure that I'm starting to think about that more, and like, again, like going back to what you said of creating that space. I really like that. And it's also the name of creating space. This is on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Brief plug. Just putting that out there.
Brief plug.
Brief plug. I think the one area that I think I've personally struggled with is like anxiety, depression. So, you know, definitely sort of, I think there was, I know, also kind of coming back to, I think, interestingly, some of the messages around mental health, messages around a lot of things where, again, it's one thing to have a standard that for ourselves that we kind of say like, this is what I want for me. But then when we put that onto other people, so like if there are folks who say, I don't want to use medication, I don't want to do this, or I want to engage in this aspect of my identity, my body, my experience in this way, as opposed to this way, like that personal agency and choice is important. And at the same time, when we project that onto other people, I think that was a thing, like I actually internalized a lot of the, like, I should be able to do this without any medication, without any of this. And so that sense of medication is bad, this is bad, like you should be able to be good on your own, like that sense of like this idea of independence.
Mind over matter.
Mind over matter, yes.
That.
And there was this really great article that I read about there's a queer Asian woman who is disabled. She talks about the myth and the oppression that is inherent within the idea of independence, and how we have this sort of sense that like the idea is we want to make sure that everyone is independent, as opposed to thinking about, again, kind of like, what is the environment, what is the space, like what are the relationships that we're cultivating and creating so that we can, again, like, why are we stigmatizing interdependence? Like, why are we stigmatizing the fact that, like, in a sense, I'm lesser than because I need help, you know, or I need support, or I need this, you know, accommodation or assistance. And so I think that was something that was helpful for me, because I definitely had a lot of negativity toward myself for the fact that I felt like I was not able to be independent of support systems, be independent of medication, be independent of the things that I need in order to you know, to live my life. And almost like this sense of like, other people can do this and other people are so strong, why can't I be as strong as they are? Right.
See, that's the impression that I don't want to give.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that, and I think that's the thing, is like that disclaimer that you gave of like, this is for me, and like how we choose to live our own lives, like that is important. Like, like having our own path for ourselves and our own desires, and like that is important. Like, absolutely. I want to live my life the way that I want to live my life, and that's important. And then when that becomes something that now bleeds into, now this becomes the expectation that binds us into a way, that's when it becomes very, very challenging.
I like that thing that you said about agency, because I get the flip side of what you get, right? I get the but all humans love connection. You should ask for help. You should depend on people, right? And my coping has taught me something completely different, which requires me to not seek out help. Requires me. I've had depression. Again, not none of this is clinically diagnosed, right? Right? Because I won't go to the doctor. I will preach therapy for people all day, every day. I think it's incredibly healthy. I think it's incredibly, I think it's good. It builds humans well. I think people should be able to access therapy and mental health services for sure, right? And yet I will not, I will openly say that I will not do the same for myself, right? There's a lot of internalized stigma where therapy is concerned that I have fully in cupfuls drunk that Kool-Aid, and I'm not in a place where I want to put in the work to reverse that, right? So anyway, so all that said, I think I've had depression since I was maybe like 14, 15 years old, since I was a teenager, right? And my coping mechanism has in fact been to become completely independent of any sort of help or any sort of interdependence, while on the outset I can fully see how important interdependence can be to the process. Necessary, significant. Huh?
And I think, and again, it's like that thing of like, as long as, again, you're choosing it as opposed to it being forced upon you.
Yeah.
Right.
Which is why this whole institutionalized anything is so problematic. Because the choices are ultimately, they're not choices, they're ultimatums, you know? And ultimatums never did anybody any good. Right? I mean, they're so toxic. My way or the highway. I don't understand that.
Like, I think that's another thing too. It's like, I will give you help regardless of whether you want it or not.
Right.
I think that's like another thing, right? It's like definitely people who will insist like this, you know, same thing with like paternalistic, white savior, blah, 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 ableist. It's just ableist. Like, oh, look, you know, you're in a wheelchair. Let me just go ahead and start pushing you. And it's like, dude, get the heck off of me.
I'm not going anywhere. I'm exactly
like, yo.
Yeah.
Like you're just touching me without my consent, you know? Like, again, like that sense of suddenly, again, forcing that sense of you don't have your own agency, and so I'm going to force my beliefs and my what I think is right upon you.
Right. Not gonna lie, I'm very careful about consent in physical space. I've never like violated anybody's physical space, but I was definitely that person until a few years ago. You know, who was like, oh my God, let me run across this desert and then cross that forest and jump over that bush to open this door for this person who never asked me to open the door for them, you know, simply because they were on crutches or in a wheelchair or whatever it is, you know. Then I met one of our delegates at Anytown, and that's why my whole perspective changed. Because we had some really good conversations, and I saw how she interacted and stuff like that. And I saw how I was interacting with her, you know, and I sensed her body language, and that's when I was like, you're trying to be really nice, but you realize you're screwing up majorly, right? You know, and then I talked to her, and then she explained it to me, which again, she should not have had to do, right? She was kind enough that she did. And yeah. After you just have to learn. But I was one of those people who, so like how people are with my pronouns, you know? They misgender me, and then I'm like, she, her, hers. And they're like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. Yeah, whatever. And it's like, yo, calm down. Let's move on, right? I was that person when it came to ability, physical ability. Yeah. What about like learning disabilities and things like that? Like how, yeah, not necessarily how is it manifested in your life per se, but where's your thinking on that with where we are right now, especially with like virtual learning and digital learning and stuff? Because I know it's so hard for us to just find like a transcripting service that we can afford. you know? So in many ways, we are not accessible for everybody, right? In what we're doing, speak a little louder. And what we're doing, I've been thinking about that a lot. Like in our virtual programming, apart from like being accessible in terms of people having technology, how accessible are we? In other words.
I mean, even just thinking about the fact that, like, again, speaking verbally and without the transcription and everything, like you know, you're talking about any town, and it's like I feel like there is a lot of experiences where at any town, like literally, I'm like, okay, like that's where I'm having a lot of opportunities for, you know, cross-cultural, you know, cross-identity interactions.
Right.
And kind of like speaking to that piece too of like hard checking on, or not hard checking, but like the soft check on, like, it's like, yeah, like this is a problem, Masa. Like,
Yeah.
like I think at one point we were, you know, exchanging, you know, communicating through writing, but then like even just that again, that personal space thing where it's just like, because I'm in the, you know, somebody's in the process of writing, and then like me just looking over their shoulder, and it's like, yo, like wait until I'm done, like let me collect my thoughts and write it down, like I will give it to
I will
you,
tell you, yeah.
I will tell you, like,
Yeah.
but like this, you know, and again, it's very similar to if somebody's speaking in a sense, and then trying to anticipate their next word and like constantly interrupting them,
Right.
you know, and like being in their face. So there's just a lot of things there. But yeah, in terms of kind of going back to what you said about learning as well, this is like one medium, um, and this is it's very limiting, you know. Like even amongst it, like you said, even amongst ourselves, it's like very like to do short bits of time is can be draining, and then hearing students who are doing 8 hours nonstop through this medium, it's like this is not, maybe some people might thrive on that, right? Some people might. And this idea that there isn't a set standard and that we learn differently, we experience the world differently, and like how do we make sure that we're optimized for that, and recognizing that if we aren't able to optimize for that, then like why are we still setting a standard for outcomes, especially when we aren't able to support everyone achieving those outcomes.
And the outcomes are never ours, are they? They're always
No.
somebody else's. Like we set the standards, but then somebody else needs to achieve them, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It brings me back to that conversation with Cami about Esau.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and that's certainly not ability based, right? There's a linguistic disadvantage there. Not even disadvantage, there's a linguistic barrier that is put in place by the system there in terms of access. But my concern is when we live in a society where ability is not, again, it's not the first thing on our minds, right? Like meeting accessibility requirements, accommodations, so on and so forth, is almost, it's mandated and yet it feels optional, right? In a lot of spaces, right? In terms of providing that kind of access to all humans of all bodies, of all abilities, right? And I think about like if those are the barriers that are in place already, because I mean, if you see our government and the system of education and the Department of Education and our education secretary and the priority that is being given or rather stripped away from humans with disabilities, right? I wonder in this like digital learning space, what accommodations can possibly be provided when in the physical learning space, those accommodations are negotiable.
This sounds almost like this could be a creating space episode.
Masa, you love creating space.
I do. I'm just saying, if anybody is watching this and you have thoughts, I'm just saying, maybe get in touch with Sam.
Uh-huh. Thank you for that invitation. Appreciate
Putting
it.
that out there.
Right.
No. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely. Like things are exasperated in with all of this that's happening.
This conversation is making me think a lot more about Anytime.
Yeah.
And how we also need to evolve and expand further into it, you know?
Like, and being proactive, like not after the fact, like not thinking like, oh, because this person is here,
Correct.
now let me do this, but like have that in advance. Like why do I have to, why is it that not until somebody is in my group that I'm like, oh, maybe I should think of a different activity?
Correct.
Right? Why is that not already a consideration?
And you don't have to think of a different activity. Every activity can be done to accommodate everybody. There is no doubt about that, right? The number of times, like, I have been in a space where, you know, like, I've had to make a suggestion to someone or whatever it is. It's to someone else's activity that I'm not privy to all of the rules for. It's taken like literally 5 minutes to switch that activity over to becoming more inclusive. Something as simple as, instead of saying run to the person across from you, just say move to the person across from you, because movement is still a possibility in that space, right? Things like that, you know, you just have to open yourself up to be able to think of it. But if you come from a perspective of, oh, that activity, we definitely can't do that, then neither you nor I nor Tammy will be doing any of this virtual programming. It wouldn't be an option.
Exactly.
You know?
So all of this was.
Yeah. It's a question of wanting to be more inclusive. So, and this is across identities, not about ability. It's cross identities. I just think people are so uncomfortable talking about ability. And I think that's because 95% of the time, we are always talking about it. We are never talking with people who are actually experiencing those spaces, you know? That's why. Like you and me talking about it now. It's real. Right? Because of the work that we do, we have a little bit more leverage. That's all. You know, we have a little bit more insight. Yeah.
All right. I think we're at 45 minutes?
About 50 minutes, yeah. 50 minutes. That's good.
Well, thank you, Sam. Just making me think more about the spaces that we are in.
I'm heavy in program director mind right now. Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you, Masa. Thank you all the folks who are on Facebook Live. We are going to be posting a survey link. If y'all could kindly take about 4 minutes, that's how long the survey should take, just to let us know how you're doing, how we're doing. We would greatly appreciate it. We always want to know how you're doing. But we are requesting that you tell us how we're doing as well, so that we can better our programs to you know, suit the requirements of our community. So any feedback that you have, we would greatly value. We are doing an evaluation for all of our programming because we do want to know how to move forward with our programming when we return forward to our new normal in our physical spaces. None of this will be going away completely, but there will be some change around it. And so we would really like to hear back from folks what they found useful, what is help, what is non-help, what they would like to see in the future. And like Masa said, any recommendations for people doing work in the community, offering insight in the community, people who are experiencing things that they're experiencing that you think should be on creating spaces as well, you can let us know. Good, Masa, anything else? Wonderful. All right. Thank you, folks, so much. If you are interested, and I hope you are, 8 p.m. tonight, we will be doing Virtual Community Circle as well. So 8 p.m. on Zoom. The link is in our social media. Please feel free to join us. Below this video, below this live video in the comments, you will find the link to the survey. Thank you all so much. Hope you have a wonderful day.